Rain pounded the rusted zinc roofs of the orphanage in Yaba that night, a storm that seemed to echo the sorrow in the hearts of the little girls huddled on the corridor floor. One was just 6, another barely 8, and the last, 10. They had no names on their records, only numbers on their worn files. No relatives, no past. Nothing but each other and the cold wind of rejection that had followed them like shadows for years. People came every month, pastors, couples, foreigners, searching for babies, or at least children with bright eyes and clean history. But these 3 had none of that. They were leftovers, as some cruel staff whispered. Girls with 2. Many questions and too few smiles. Yet that same night, a black Range Rover pulled through the rusty gate, its tires sending waves of muddy water across the yard. The man who stepped out was not the usual kind of visitor. He wore no long cassock or charity logo t-shirt. His agbada was white, spotless, and his face calm like someone used to signing checks that could buy cities. His name was Chief Maxwell. Iroanya, a self-made billionaire from Anambra, who had buried his wife 5 years earlier after cancer chewed through her like paper. Since then, he had tried everything, counseling, travel, even prayer mountains, but nothing softened the ache in his chest. Until a strange dream came repeatedly. 3 girls, always in rags, always staring at him like he owed them something. When he shared it with his pastor, the answer was clear. He was being called to father again. The matron had stammered when he declared that he wasn't here for donations but for adoptions, 3 of them. And not infants. He wanted those who had been forgotten, those whose files had gathered dust. "Give me the ones no one else wants," he had said firmly, shocking the staff into silence. In the weeks that followed, the girls, Ngozi, Amara, and Ifunanya, were given more than names. They were given hope. They were moved into a mansion in Lekki Phase 1, into separate rooms with soft beds and fairy lights. They were assigned tutors, drivers, chefs, even a therapy dog. But more than that, they were bathed daily in affection. Chief Maxwell didn't treat them like charity projects. He called them his girls, and they slowly began to believe they were worthy of love. Time flowed like the river Niger. The girls grew, healed, and bloomed under Maxwell's structured but nurturing hand. Amara discovered a gift for painting and began filling the mansion walls with color. Ngozi excelled in numbers and led debates in school that left judges speechless. Ifunanya, the eldest, turned to gardening and architecture, often saying, "This house gave me life. I want to design homes that feel the same." Their bond was unbreakable, their gratitude deep. People often whispered, "Why would a billionaire with everything risk his legacy on 3 rejects?" But Maxwell never answered them. He only smiled when the girls called him Papa, especially during their Sunday yam porridge rituals on the rooftop. By the time each girl turned 18, the world had begun to notice. Ngozi got a scholarship to London School of Economics. Amara's art hung in Lagos galleries, while Ifunanya was offered an internship in one of Africa's top architectural firms. But before they left, Maxwell called them into his study and reminded them of one thing. Legacy is not about money. It's about memory. Make this world remember why you were adopted. They nodded, carrying his words like secret vows. 25. Years passed in quiet brilliance. They became women of global repute, each successful in her field. But they had never forgotten the mud, the storm, the rejection. And they had not forgotten the man who lifted them from it. Now, as the press circled the grand inauguration stage in Abuja, a huge curtain was pulled back to reveal what the world did not expect, a towering facility called the Maxwell Shelter. Not an orphanage, not a school, but a compound that trained abandoned children to become thinkers, builders, and leaders. Fully funded, fully designed, fully run by Ngozi, Amara, and Ifunanya. But their final surprise was yet to come. The unveiling of the Maxwell Shelter was more than a ceremony. It was a national event. Ministers sat shoulder to shoulder with CEOs, while journalists jostled for position under the blazing Abuja sun. Drones hovered silently above the crowd, capturing every angle of the massive compound carved from 6 acres of prime land. Marble statues flanked the entrance, each one depicting a child rising from the earth, hands stretched toward the sky. Carved into the foundation were the words, "From the forgotten, we build the future." The air vibrated with applause, but what none of them knew was that the grand gesture was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, the trio had orchestrated something even their father did not expect. Months before the launch, they had secretly drafted the paperwork to relinquish all financial stakes in their individual companies and merge them into a singular foundation, the Iroanya Legacy Trust. The trust would absorb their fortunes and funnel the proceeds into a chain of institutions modeled after the Maxwell Shelter, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. From the crowded slums of Kibera to the dusty outskirts of Kano, their reach would stretch like vines of redemption. Maxwell had been told there would be a surprise tribute at the end of the inauguration, but he hadn't expected to be called on stage by all 3 of his daughters. They appeared not as little girls anymore, but as titans in their fields, draped in symbolic Ankara fabrics dyed in the orphanage's original blue and white colors. The crowd fell silent as Ifunanya stepped forward with an envelope in her hand. Maxwell's brows furrowed as she handed it to him with both hands and bowed her head. Inside the envelope was a simple document, a legal deed transferring full ownership of the shelter and the upcoming institutions to Maxwell Iroanya, founding guardian. Tears gathered in his eyes, not because of the recognition, but because he finally understood. He had not just raised daughters. He had planted architects of transformation. Their lives weren't his reward. Their work was, and now the world would know it too. That evening, back in the mansion, the celebration continued under the stars. The rooftop had been transformed, once again, this time into a garden party filled with fairy lights, old friends, and memories too powerful for words. Maxwell sat quietly, sipping palm wine from a calabash handed to him by a former security guard turned family friend. His gaze swept across the crowd, not politicians or celebrities, but children from the original orphanage, now grown, now proud. Some were teachers, others nurses. One had returned from Canada as a software engineer. And just as he was about to rise for a toast, a little hand tugged his agbada. He looked down to find a child barely 5, eyes wide, barefoot, with dirt smudged across his chin. The boy looked just like Amara once had. Maxwell bent low and whispered, "Are you okay, my son?" The boy shook his head and mumbled about being hungry. Maxwell rose, took the boy's hand, and led him through the crowd to the buffet table. That single gesture was caught on camera. Maxwell serving rice to the child while the founders looked on, smiling through tears. The photo went viral the next morning. Headlines screamed, "The billionaire who adopted 3 rejects still has room for 1 more." But what the world didn't see was the quiet agreement that followed. The boy would not be taken into a shelter. He would go home with Maxwell. That was the true legacy. But still, the daughters had one final mission. In the weeks that followed the inauguration, the nation buzzed with conversation. Newspapers printed front-page features. Radio shows recited the story like a folktale passed through generations. Social media exploded with hashtags like Maxwell Shelter, From Rejected to Royals, and Legacy of Love. But for the 3 sisters, this was not a climax. It was only the prelude. Behind the polished speeches and golden plaques lay a deeper intention, to upend the very system that once discarded them. They returned to the cities that had ignored their cries decades ago. Amara went to Badagry, where she once stood in line for spoilt bread from a bakery that had treated orphans like pests. She bought the entire bakery chain quietly and turned it into a culinary arts school for homeless children. Ngozi moved into a flat above a failed tutoring center in Ajagunle, where she started a program that trained orphans in coding, business, and financial literacy. Ifunanya traveled deep into the slums of Makoko, where her architecture skills birthed floating classrooms and eco-shelters built with recycled materials but structured with the dignity of palaces. But they didn't stop there. They launched a national policy initiative, the Home Before the Home Plan. The goal was revolutionary: ensure that no child waited in an institution without first being introduced into a mentorship family structure. Each volunteer home anchor was trained, vetted, and supported to foster not just discipline, but identity and love. For them, no child would be left to rot in files, waiting for a miracle. The system would be the miracle. Maxwell, now in his late 60s, watched all this unfold with quiet awe. The mansion was no longer a palace of stillness, but a hub of motion. Children came and went. Meetings turned into mentoring. The rooftop garden became a sanctuary of planning, praying, and dreaming. He had once feared that his daughters would drift away into distant places, lost in ambition. But instead, they had turned ambition into a rope that pulled broken people from the pit. And in a private corner of the study, where his late wife's piano still sat covered in dust cloth, Maxwell did something he hadn't done in decades. He played again. Not a sad song, not a lament, but a soft, rolling hymn of gratitude. The same one his wife used to hum when they first opened their small trading shop in Onitsha years ago. She had always believed in destiny, and now, the proof of it laughed and worked in the rooms she once dreamed of filling with children. Then one morning, a letter arrived. Not from the government, not from a board, but from the United Nations. It invited Maxwell and his daughters to Geneva for the annual Human Impact Summit. The reason? The Irowanya legacy had been nominated for the Global Humanitarian Blueprint Award, the highest honor given to non-governmental figures who had redefined compassion. The family didn't hold a press conference. They didn't parade the letter. They simply packed a bag, hugged the children at the mansion, and boarded a quiet flight out of Abuja. In Geneva, seated beneath flags of every nation, surrounded by presidents, queens, and thinkers, the girls stood behind their father as he was handed the microphone. Cameras clicked. The room leaned in, and Maxwell, standing there in a simple Nigerian kaftan stitched with his daughter's initials on the cuffs, said only this: "I once gave 3 girls a home. They gave the world a new one." The silence that followed was sacred. Even the interpreter paused. The room erupted with applause, but in Maxwell's heart, there was only stillness. The kind of stillness that arrives after a promise has finally been fulfilled. When the family returned to Nigeria, it was no longer to fanfare, but to a quiet dinner on the same rooftop where it all began. The boy Maxwell had adopted weeks ago, now freshly bathed and wearing clean clothes, ran across the garden with laughter that cracked through the city noise. And there, beneath fairy lights and bowls of steaming jollof, the man who once mourned, his wife in silence found joy not in riches or awards, but in the lives that refused to be forgotten. And so the story closed, not with an ending, but with a legacy still being written, every single day, by 3 women who were once rejected, until one man said yes. Time, like the Harmattan wind, moved with both grace and force. 5 years had passed since the Maxwell shelter rose in Abuja, like a monument of mercy. What began as a home for the forgotten had grown into a global movement with 12 branches, across Africa and partnerships in 3 continents. But for the sisters, the real miracle wasn't in buildings or awards, it was in stories. Stories of children who once slept under bridges now learning violin in Vienna. Of boys once called thieves, now leading clean water campaigns in the Niger Delta. Of girls once mocked for dreaming now designing prosthetics for war survivors in South Sudan. But even legacies face storms. A sudden illness gripped Maxwell without warning. At first he waved it off, Just tired bones, he'd say. But the doctors saw what age and quiet grief had quietly built, a weakening heart. The man who had lifted 3 girls from the shadows was now struggling to lift himself. As news of his health spread, visitors poured in like pilgrims to a shrine. Staff from the original orphanage, now retired. Past beneficiaries, politicians, journalists. But through it all, Maxwell smiled only when his daughters were near. He didn't fear death. What he feared was leaving without reminding them of the deeper purpose behind it all. And so, in his final weeks, he gathered them on the rooftop, the same place where fairy lights had once danced above bowls of porridge and plans. The breeze was gentle that evening. The city lights below shimmered like quiet blessings, and there, in his cracked voice, he gave them one final charge. You were never just rescued. You were repositioned. Never forget, wealth may open doors, but mercy keeps them open. Teach that to the world. When he passed in his sleep days later, the nation wept. Flags flew at half-mast. The federal government offered to name a street after him. The daughters refused. Instead, they chose to rename all Maxwell Shelter classrooms. Across Africa, after orphans whose lives had been transformed under his guidance. Every child who entered would sit in a room that bore a name like their own, because that was Maxwell's deepest lesson. No one is above love. At his burial, there were no celebrities in front rows. The girls had invited only the ones Maxwell had once fed, mentored, or quietly sponsored. The grave was dug beside the small orchard he had planted behind the shelter. 3 mango trees grew there, each one named after the girls he once saved. But just when the story seemed to have drawn its final curtain, another chapter opened. 10 years later, on the same land where Maxwell once walked, a new structure rose from the soil, the Irowanya Institute of Rehumanization and Social Recovery. The first of its kind in Africa, the institute trained future policymakers, humanitarian architects, and psychological first responders. A place where trauma met strategy, where pain was not just heard, but transformed. And at the heart of the institute was a bronze statue, not of Maxwell alone, but of 4 figures, him and the 3 girls, cast mid-step, hands clasped, heads lifted. A plaque beneath read, "We were not rescued, we were rebuilt. Now we rebuild the world." On opening day, a young girl stood at the foot of the statue. Her name was Anuli, rejected by 5 families, called cursed, beaten for being born albino. But that day, she stood tall in a fresh uniform, holding a new backpack with Irowanya Institute stitched in gold. She had just been admitted on full scholarship. When asked what she wanted to be, she didn't say president or doctor. She looked at the statue, then whispered, "I want to be someone who sees others, like him." And with that single answer, Maxwell's legacy lived again, not in marble, not in headlines, but in a girl, once forgotten, now found. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more heartfelt stories to life, one soul at a time. Please subscribe the Folkteller Bae